Patterns of compensation in elite level show jumpers, particularly Olympic show jumpers. Welcome to this webinar, and I'm going to be talking about compensations and show jumpers. I have spent the winter in Dubai and had the very fortunate pleasure of actually just training some elite level show jumpers. So I thought I would share my experience, but also share exactly what I found in terms of patterns of compensation and also just general case studies, because I think that's how we learn, right? We're practical people and we learn by practical examples. So let's get to the next bit. Today I'm going to talk about the recap, so summary of actually the webinar 1, 2, and 3. So this is actually webinar 4. And in webinar 1 and 3, we deep dived into things like anatomy, particularly when it comes to pelvic engagement in our horses. And they're going to give you a little bit of an overview of the winter in Dubai, and then exactly how I went about treating these show jumpers. And again, recognizing what kind of patterns of compensation I found. I'm going to give you a case study as well. So just a bit of an overview from webinar 1. Webinar 1 was all about the pelvis and its power generation. And for me, this is quite an important topic, because before we can understand how to get more power, how we can understand hind limb engagement in our horses, we need to understand what the pelvis is and the girdle and how power is generated. So in webinar 1, we deep dived into anatomy and explaining exactly the mechanisms of creating pelvic power, but also what anatomy and structures are involved in, particularly the pelvis region. If you missed it, have a little look at webinar 1 and watch that first. It'll make more sense. Just to go over as a bit of a review of what we did is I looked at specifically the mechanism of flexion and extension in the pelvis. A lot of people assume, and we think, and I actually thought this originally, that to generate better engagement, I needed just the limbs to be working better. So commonly people look at things like the hock, the stifle, and the back, but actually we're really missing a fundamental point of flexion extension, which is the hip, the lumbosacral junction, that connection. Yes, you need the distal limb joints to be functioning well, but actually the cause of the engagement is because of a muscle group called the iliopsoas, cranial-femoral muscles, which help in shortening the hind limbs. Obviously, the abdominals are involved as well. And then the kind of opposite happens with lengthening and extension. So again, if you want to know more information about this, refer back to webinar 1 as we deep dive into pelvis anatomy, and especially what causes pelvic engagement. Webinar 2, we went into specific exercises for pelvic engagement. Many of us know anatomy. Many of us have read around, okay, now we understand why and how the pelvis engagement is created, but what specifically can we do with our horses? What specific exercises can we do? And I went deep dive into webinar 2 with some research, 5 case studies. I'm just going to go briefly through them now. But again, if you want a full list of these studies, then please do message me, email me. That's absolutely fine. I can give you a list of them. But just a little bit of advice in general with any form of research that you're hearing from other people is, guys, actually read the research yourself, because I interpret research the way I read, and you might interpret it slightly different. So never take things factual. Someone once said to me, take information from other people like spare ribs. You take the bits you like, the good bits, and then you chuck the rest. And that's the same here. So if you're dubious, skeptical, as we all should be curious, then read the research yourself. And as I said, if you email me, I've got the list of the 5 studies with the links that you can just directly click on the links and read the research yourself and make your own conclusion. In study 1, I've just written down the information here because there is quite a lot. The study was by Hillary and her team in, I think it was 2015, so a little bit of an older study, but they looked at assessing the impact of gymnastic training and dynamic mobilization exercises on improving stride length and enhancing the size of the epaxial muscles in therapy horses. So this is a really practical and fab study. I really enjoyed reading it. And what I liked about it was very relatable, that I could take some of the research from there and apply it. The only thing though, like all studies, they have limitations, and the limitation of the study is actually in the title. If you read there, it says in therapy horses. So how many of us actually treat and deal with therapy horses? And that's key. So a lot of us deal with competition horses. So you could argue and say, well, should the study be replicated using competition horses? Yes, of course. But they specifically also looked at the size cross-sectional area of the multifidus muscle, which is a postural muscle. And by doing a specific set of exercises from gym training to mobilization exercises, the cross-sectional area over a specific time done a specific amount in a week improved the postural multifidus muscle size. So again, with that kind of research, we know going forward, okay, we're having an impact on the horse's postural muscles. So that's a really good study, in my opinion. The second study was by Ava Frick, and explores the effectiveness of stretching exercises for horses, highlighting their potential to increase range of motion, improve body flexibility and posture, and prevent injury by strengthening supportive tissues. Again, a really practical exercise, a little bit older. I want to say, I think it was 2017, if I've written down, but it's got real practical statement and advice here about stretching horses both dynamically and statically to increase the range of motion. They've also said that by doing this, you're going to prevent muscle strain. A proper warm-up with these stretching exercises, they've said here, reduces the risk of muscle strain, improves flexibility, and extensibility of collagen within the tendons and joints. So we know a lot of this in the human research, but there still is more and more studies like this required for horses as well. Study number 3 I looked at was the effect of elastic training resistant band on the back kinematics of horses trotting in hand and on the lunge. Again, I get questions and asked this all the time with resistance bands. How long should I use them for? What resistance strength should I be applying to the horse in hand ridden lunging? And this is why I like the study done in 2017. And the results showed that resistance bands reduce the mediolateral and rotational movement of the thoracolumbar region. So basically providing dynamic stability, which is what we want, right? When we're increasing movement and load on the horse's body, you want to make sure that the back is as stable as it can be for our horses. This study showed that the use of this band was effective. Again, if you want to read this in full, refer back to the link. If you want the link, email me directly. They did say that further studies should investigate the underlying mechanism and with reference to core abdominal engagement from the hindquarters to establish the long-term effects of using elastic bands. So there are, again, very many limitations with this, and you would always argue is, should you be applying this standard training regime across all horses? Probably not. This is just for the specific group of horses. Study number 4 looked at the effect of ground poles and elastic resistant bands on longissimus dorsi, rectus abdominis muscle activity during walk, trot. And I really enjoyed the study as well. It was 2001 by Shaw and his group of authors. And what I liked about this is that they support the use of ground poles for increasing muscle activation, suggesting that there is a significant effect of resistant bands on core activation in trot. So they're showing that there is a positive effect here on the horse's body through muscle activation with adding ground poles and resistance bands. Again, you could counter argue this and say, can you now provide a valid recommendation of this to your clients? Probably not. It has to be relatable in terms of the cohort of horses used, the breed of horses, the training management, all those factors and variables we have to consider. But it's positive that studies like this are coming out. And the first study we looked at was the effects of the use of the Equiami training aid on the kinematics of the horse at walk and trot in hand. Equiamis, Pessoas, they've been around for so much and such a long time, so it's good to know that there are studies out there. This was a 2002 study by Calzone and his authors, or his research partners. And the study underscored the importance of considering individual characteristics. So again, there was results to show that whether you could say positive or negative, there was an effect on the body of the use of the Equiami in hand in walk and trot. Now, whether that is, again, a standard aftercare across the board, no. Unfortunately, you can't suggest that every horse should work in an Equiami. And that's what I followed on from then from webinar 2, which was depending on what I'm seeing from the horse assessment, postural assessment, dynamic assessment, what the rider's feeling under saddle, I would then prescribe specific exercises for, this is again linked to pelvic engagement. And I just gave you an overview example of stable-based exercises, and that would be, for example, trail traction, caudal pelvic tilts, abdominal tilts. This would then be progressed over a period of time to using transitions in hand, no rider, where you can vary the intensity of transitions. I've demonstrated and showed a study using by Brian Storm et al. 2002, which was the benefit of walking circles and that effect on the horse's core and particularly the back muscles. And then the importance of lateral work in hand as well, before we move to ridden exercises for engagement. So again, I stressed in this webinar that don't go and copy this and give these to all your clients. It has to be specific, and you have to have the clinical evaluation and reasoning as to why you've given these exercises as well. And so that was webinar 2. In webinar 3, and we went into some case studies on pelvic asymmetry. So again, like I said, we're practical people. We want to know, okay, if we've got these asymmetries in the pelvis, what should we be doing? I really enjoyed this webinar because I actually threw the question out there from the start, which is treat or not to treat. So should we treat every asymmetry that we see or not? Debatable. I'd love to know your thoughts and questions as well. So if you do have any questions, comment, and I'll definitely get back to you. I looked at and I gave you a real case study of a horse. We called him Rod the Sod, and then we looked at another case study of a show jumper called Ronnie. So in Rod the Sod's, I'll just call him Rod. In Rod's case study, he was a horse that very, very talented eventer, only 6 years old, and suddenly started showing behavioral signs under saddle. Now, I say that in quotations because we all know that behavior is, in my opinion, the way the horse expresses their either discomfort or letting you know that something isn't quite right. So how else can they let you know that something is not quite right? It was a really fascinating and interesting case because we came together as a team. So we had the vet, the trainer, the owner, myself, and the handler. And I say the handler's probably the most important person to be there and to understand everything, because that person is the person that sees the horse every single day. And within Rod's case, we did a lot of modalities in stages as he progressed. So number 1 was identifying the pain. Obviously, you need to rule out pain, work with your team. We came up with a plan. We then went into medication because under ultrasound, diagnostic ultrasound, we find that he had injury to the dorsal sacroiliac ligaments, which was causing the asymmetry in the pelvic girdle. Then we went on to specific exercises in hand, stable-based in hand, then in hand with tack before the rider was introduced. And this was over a decent period of time. we utilized a combination of taping, chiropractic, class 3B laser, sensory stimulation, training aids and styles. I stressed this in webinar 3 about the training aids and styles because what I consider in-hand work might be different to what you consider in-hand work and the next person. So if you're going to prescribe in-hand exercises, watch your handler perform them. And in Rod's example here is his handler was trained in a horsemanship style that was a great style, but for what we needed his body to be doing, it was actually it was encouraging a very upward movement in the cervical pole region, which was having a negative effect on his spine. So we changed the training aid and style, not for more pressure, but to encourage a bit of a lower open horizontal frame, which significantly improved his behavior. Actually, he went from a horse that was very like chewing on the bit, or even when no bit was in his mouth, he would play and make these really exaggerated jaw movements that weren't really necessary if he was moving comfortably. But when we realized we altered his neck and head positioning by just applying a little bit of rope pressure to the nose, there was no restriction in terms of that we never used anything to force the neck down. Totally opened his spine up in a different way that he stopped this mouthing action completely. We introduced walking flat poles, depending on how he was progressing. We also played with different terrains, always had his teeth looked at as well. The farrier played a huge integral part because he came to us with a horse that was fully shod. And we noticed as we started to change the mechanisms of function higher up, so in the pelvic girdle, the shoulder girdle, the spine, he loaded so differently. And therefore, having a farrier that was quite observant and was able to give us some awareness, but also explanation as to why this was happening was a really good, again, open communication team approach. And then obviously the final thing before we got to introducing the rider was ensuring the saddle was fitting, because his body changed so much shape over the 12-week period that we wanted to make sure that we weren't then putting an ill-fitting saddle on. Really good case study. Again, if you want to if you have any questions, comment below, let me know, email me. And at the same time, if you want to learn more about that in detail, go back to webinar 3. The second case study was a lovely mare called Ronnie, who was a talented young show jumper, only 6 years old, very, very talented girl. But she was having rider, I wouldn't say issues, but because she was performing well, she was jumping meter 20, show jumping, but the rider always felt that the warm-up was extremely long. She was very heavy in the contact, and she felt no matter what kind of exercises she was doing, that the same issues were occurring in the warm-up. When I first met Ronnie, I explained this in webinar 3 that I was really debating whether I should adjust the pelvis, whether I should actually do much to this pelvis because of where she was in her career, her current training regime, and the fact that she was asymmetric to me, so there was something going on. We spoke to the vet, we spoke to the rider, and it was all agreement that no, let's adjust and realign the pelvic girdle, improve range of motion. And this is what happened. Not good, right? Not good at all. So as you can see from the video, she went lame in front. So right, 4, what on earth happened? Yeah, in webinar 3, we go into more detail about how and why this happened. If you have any questions, let me know. But again, we took a very team systematic approach with giving specific exercises and involved a variety of modalities like taping, laser. Again, there was a period of rest, We adapted the shoeing. We gave specific pelvic girdle exercises, progressing to swimming, pole work, and riding, and back exercising, back in full competition. I talked about in webinar 3 about the lessons I learned. So the beauty about having a team makes such a difference. When you're out there alone as a therapist, it can get quite lonely. It really can. So it was nice to fall back on ideas, have open conversations as to why, what, and how, what might be happening. Also having learned, we always say this, but actually these real life case studies really bring them home, is owner compliance. Because in Rod's case, like I said, we had a very capable handler, but she was using a style of training that just wasn't suited to where he was at the stage of his rehab. So again, having that open communication to say, could we try this approach, a different approach to encourage this style because of this reasoning, made a huge difference to that horse's training and his rehab. And the other thing is, I said here about having some self-belief, because the last thing I would ever want to do as a therapist or person is hurt and make something go worse. But in the reality, it can happen. They're animals. So having that bit of belief in yourself and reasoning as to why you've done something is always good. And actually also be prepared to be wrong as well. This is a very subjective field when we're out there, even though we have the training, and a lot of what we do when we're with the horses is feel, instinctive intuition, and treat what you see. So yeah, have that bit of belief with no ego, for me, goes a long way. And I now just want to share this with you. So this was actually my winter in Dubai. It was a really awesome few months, bit of an emotional roller coaster as well. I'm not going to pull the wool over your eyes and say everything was unicorns and fairies, but it was a story in my life, chapter in my life that I will never forget. To give you some background about it, so having never been to Dubai for this period, my partner and I went there for 3 months. And the second week being there, I had a phone call from a lady who I'd met 8 years ago. And she said to me, right, you are going, oh, like, are you here? Well, first of all, are you here in Dubai? Yep, great, okay. There'll be a car picking up Tuesday. So I thought, okay, this is great. And when I got picked up, and we drove about an hour to where the yard was. Nothing really much gets said about where you're going, and obviously knew I was treating show jumpers. And when I arrived there, beautiful setup, beautiful yard, but it only ended up being the Olympic team. So yeah, it was a fantastic setup, awesome people, very open communication, and very professional. I really enjoyed and felt grateful to be working there. Their preparation and goal was to, and is to, go to the Paris Olympics this year and compete for a medal. So high standards, and very talented riders, trainers, and horses. So as this title of the webinar stated, we're looking at the patterns of Grand Prix show jumpers. It was a massive, massive shift for me, having to adapt my treatment, because these guys are competing at the top of their game. They are competing almost every weekend in build-up and preparation for the Olympics. So doing full body adjustments wasn't the way forward with these. It was minor adjustments for the compensations, and also very open communication and assessment from rider, horse, and trainer. So it was different for me, totally different to what I'm normally working with, because I don't often rock up to a yard and have the whole team there. It's normally me. And in this case, the team was there every single day. Amazing setup, right? So just to clarify, Grand Prix, for those of you that don't know, is when horses are jumping on average 1.60 m for single jumps and up to 2 meters for spreads. So decent sized jumps, anything between 10 to 16 jumps per round. It's such an art of training these horses in between their events and competitions, because you want to rule out and iron out the weaknesses, develop and progress the strengths without overloading the body. Because let's face it, show jumping has massive biomechanical repeated stresses on bones, joints, tendons, and muscular systems. So it's very high level repeated stress on the body. So the art of managing how much is too much is a fine line with these guys. Therefore, we had to be so careful about what we were doing in between the events so that we weren't pushing the body too much, but also were helping in recovery, injury prevention before events and after events. We also had to look at adapting supportive exercises. So when they weren't jumping, what exercises could we do in between that almost mimic the show jumping requirements, but without pushing the body? Does that make sense? So that would be things like lateral work, head and neck positioning, really important, to really work on that range of motion, because that's really required in phases of jumping, but then also things like rein back, so that you're imposing less stress on the muscular, on the MSK system, but you're still asking the body to almost move in that range of motion. It was really important to understand why certain horses jumped the way they did. And this was interesting for me as well, going into very, very much the detail of this. So, for example, do any of them have any rotation in their spine? If any of them are dropping one foreleg compared to the other, and understanding the different demands of how the body adapts over a high single fence versus like a double oxer. So yeah, it was really fine-tuning my eye, but also in relation to what the horse's conformation and posture was already. A key thing about jumping, and this video really displays it, is there are different phases of jumping. So you've got your preparation for takeoff, you've got your takeoff, the airborne, the landing, the recovery from the landing. Understanding and assessing how and what each horse did in this phase was fundamental to helping with compensation pattern and helping increase performance or increase recovery time. In each of these phases, we had to really look at what the limbs were doing in each of the phase, look at what the neck, the trunk, and the hindquarters, which once you slowed it down, listening to what the rider said as well, you could really then iron out, okay, this muscle group here needs a little bit more work. Obviously, we know it's all connected, but it could be affecting the airborne phase or the landing phase of the jump. A big thing was also looking at and understanding the differences before and after competition in their compensation patterns. So the patterns were very different before to after competition. So if you think about before competition, they're not jumping at all like the same height in a course. You know, they might practice 1 or 2 jumps repetitively to iron out the technique, but they wouldn't be jumping a full course, which affects the body differently in developing compensations. The rider positioning aids are different as well. So like we know as riders that you can train at home, you relax, you're in your own space, your horse is relaxed. Going to events, you ride differently. So I also noticed the difference in where the horse and rider posture was just naturally different as well before and after competition. You need to be very, I noticed a big difference in more of like a spinal restriction, dysfunction pattern before competitions, whereas after competitions, totally different. The pace is obviously quicker in a competition. They're jumping a full round of the 10 to 16 jumps, maybe even 2 rounds if it's a jump off. Anxiety is different, and therefore the body is pushed at full max capacity, which, depending on any pre-existing conditions that a horse might have, this affected the girdles of the horse totally different. So I found after competition, the ventral cervical muscles a lot of CT restriction due to the extension of the head and the neck. And as you can see in this picture here, this is the over a double here, imagine what is happening in the CT junction being pushed to full extension. That has a significant effect on the entire body. I'll just get my train of thought again. So the CT restriction in full extension assists in the lightening the forehand, lowering the hindquarters to achieve ground contact, and also due to the lifting of the thorax and concentric contraction. So basically what that means is I noticed that after competition, horses were really tight in the pectoral girdle, the subclavius, serratus ventralis thoracics, because of the action of having to lift those forelegs up and clear the fences, which, like, these horses are elite athletes. They perform on the day. Like, they will do anything to not hit that fence. So they push their body, they push those cranial femoral muscles, they push the cranial serratus muscles, cervical muscles to full flexion to not knock that fence, which has compensatory effects. I also noticed after competition that a lot more dysfunction through the sublumbar fascia, the lumbosacral junction required a lot more treatment, a lot of care compared to before a competition. I'm going to give you a case study here. This was a beautiful mare who is a fantastic jumper, but she, despite being such a tough, hardy mare, in between competition, her saddle would be slipping forwards a lot. The rider would say that she would take ages to warm up, very heavy, solid in the contact, which would affect, if you watched her walk and trot in the beginning, very short, choppy strides. What do we do here? We actually did a full assessment. So first, ruled out pain. This mare had a weakness through one of her stifles that she had treated when she was very young and is looked after, rescanned every 6 months to make sure that the joint isn't compromised. This has a knock-on effect on the front end, and probably why we put our heads together and came to the conclusion that we had to change her warm-up routine alongside either a lot of treatment in the shoulder girdle, CT junction, to help this mare, just especially after jumping, because she already had a weakness in one of the very important joints in her hindquarters, which caused offloading onto the forehand more than anything else. So once we looked at freeing up the shoulder girdle, looking at different warm-up exercises that her and the rider could do, the saddle stopped slipping. So this was a great example. Another thing that I just want to share with you is I was actually introduced to shockwave treatment from a musculoskeletal perspective. So for those of you that don't know what shockwave is, it's a non-invasive modality, extracorporeal shockwave. So basically that means they use sound waves outside of the body to stimulate healing in wounds, ligaments, tendons, and bony structures. So in these guys' perspective, because it's non-invasive, you're not injecting anything into the body, it's fantastic to help with treating musculoskeletal problems, soft tissue injuries, and any bone injuries. So for these guys, we use it a lot for the paraspinal musculature. Only thing is the horses had to be sedated, but I noticed in my job from a soft tissue perspective, after shockwave, the body was so much easier to treat. The horses recovered so much quicker and they were so much happier. So I actually really enjoyed using this modality, and really grateful to have been allowed to use it alongside a very experienced vet. But it was it was a new modality for me, and I could visibly see and palpably feel the results right in front of me. Just to give you some more, what I learned about it was shockwave meets the interfaces of different impedance. So basically, when like a soft tissue surface, it changes within the tissues are stimulated and created. So this includes like increase of blood flow to the area, direct cellular effects, and has a analgesic effect. So basically pain relief. So horses that had maybe like 3 weeks off before a competition, if we shocked wave them, with some corrective exercises. Their recovery time was a hell of a lot quicker. Their behavior was a hell of a lot better as well. They looked happier. So yeah, that was the use of shockwave, like I said, a new modality, which God, yeah, I would definitely recommend as well for these guys. And yeah, this is just a lovely picture just to share something personal. I went on a beach ride in Dubai, which was one of my dreams, to ride a horse in the sea. As you can see, stripped off the tack. And to be honest, I just walked. Like, they were such kind animals, and to be in the water with them was just incredible. So that was definitely a highlight of the 3 months for me as well. Any questions you have, please just comment, or you can email me at info@animalchiropractoruk.com. I'm more than happy to answer any questions. And thank you so much for joining in and listening.